The first light of dawn crept over the Chizos Mountains, casting long shadows across the sprawling desert floor. Daniel Hayes, a park ranger with nearly 2 decades of service, stood beside his patrol truck at the edge of the trailhead. He had been up before sunrise, sipping bitter coffee in the small ranger station, going over his daily assignments. Today's route was one he knew well, an isolated trail that snaked through rugged canyons and vast stretches of scrubland where the silence felt almost alive. The summer heat was already beginning to press down, though it was barely past 8 o'clock. Daniel adjusted his wide-brimmed hat, strapped on his utility belt, and did a quick check of his gear. His service revolver was holstered at his side, a radio clipped to his shoulder, binoculars hanging around his neck. In the truck's back seat sat his backpack, canteen, trail maps, and a first aid kit neatly packed, just as it always was. Before stepping onto the trail, he took one last look at the empty parking area. There were no tourists this early, no signs of movement anywhere. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a patchwork of sun-bleached rocks, cactus, and distant blue ridges that shimmered in the rising heat. He keyed the radio and called in his location. "Ranger Hayes, Trail 47. Starting patrol," he said in his calm, steady voice. "Copy that, Daniel. Stay safe," came the reply. The first miles were familiar, narrow dirt paths winding through mesquite thickets, the crunch of gravel under his boots, the occasional scurry of a lizard darting away into the brush. A hawk circled high overhead, its cry sharp and lonely. Daniel kept a watchful eye on the terrain. This section of Big Bend wasn't just remote, it was unforgiving. Temperatures could swing from blistering heat to freezing cold in the span of hours. A misstep, an injury, a missed landmark could mean the difference between life and death out here. Half an hour in, he paused on a rise overlooking a shallow canyon. The wind was faint, carrying only the dry scent of dust and sage. Everything seemed as it should, quiet, untouched. Still, he took out his binoculars and scanned the horizon. Far to the south, he spotted movement, just a flicker, near a cluster of boulders. It was gone before he could focus in. Probably just a coyote or a stray goat from a nearby ranch, he told himself, but he made a mental note of the spot. As he continued deeper into the backcountry, the landscape began to shift. Rocks grew jagged, the ground uneven, and the trail less distinct. He'd walked this path dozens of times, yet something about it felt heavier today, as though the air itself had thickened. He reached for his canteen and took a slow drink, listening to the eerie stillness. No birds, no insects. Just the sound of his own breathing. At 9:15 a.m., he called in again. "All good here. Moving toward the ridge," he reported. His tone was casual, almost bored, but there was a subtle edge in his voice that the dispatcher might not have noticed. That was the last transmission anyone ever heard from Daniel Hayes. Somewhere ahead, the trail curved sharply and dropped out of sight into the shadow of a canyon wall. He adjusted his pack and stepped forward without hesitation. Moments later, the wind shifted, carrying with it a faint, metallic tang, something out of place in the clean desert air. He slowed his pace, scanning the rocks, unaware that beyond that bend, his footprints would soon be the final trace of him anyone would ever see. 2 hours later, when he failed to check in as scheduled, the first seeds of worry were sown back at the ranger station. By sunset, his truck still sat at the trailhead, keys in the ignition, radio silent. And the vast desert around it kept its secrets. By late afternoon on the day Daniel Hayes went missing, the mood at Big Bend's ranger station had shifted from mild concern to urgency. He hadn't checked in for hours, and repeated attempts to reach him over the radio went unanswered. At first, some of his colleagues assumed he had simply wandered into a low-signal area, common in the park's sprawling wilderness, but when the sun dipped lower and the temperature began to fall, unease hardened into alarm. Within an hour, the first search team was assembled. 3 rangers set out from the trailhead where Daniel's patrol truck still sat, its driver's door unlocked, the keys dangling in the ignition. His backpack was gone, but his spare radio sat in the glove compartment. On the passenger seat lay a half-empty bottle of water and a folded map with a section circled in red ink. The marked area was several miles from the point where the trail vanished into a maze of canyons. The team followed the trail's dusty path under the fading light, their boots crunching against the gravel. At first, they found clear footprints, deep, steady impressions that matched Daniel's size and tread pattern. The prints led into a shallow wash, flanked by jagged ridges. The desert air was cooling quickly, but the heat of the day still radiated off the rocks. 2 miles in, they found the first strange clue: Daniel's wide-brimmed ranger hat, caught on the thorny branch of a mesquite tree just off the trail. It looked as though it had been ripped away by the wind or knocked loose in a hurry. The ground around it showed no signs of struggle, no drag marks, no scattered items. Just the footprints, still crisp in the dirt. Over the next 2 days, the search intensified. Helicopters were brought in, sweeping low over the terrain. From the air, the desert stretched endlessly, rolling hills of ochre and rust, dotted with spiny ocotillo plants and ancient boulders. Searchers on foot combed through ravines and climbed rocky outcrops, calling Daniel's name until their voices went hoarse. On the 3rd day, a volunteer team discovered his canteen lying half buried in loose sand, a mile off the main trail. It was empty, the cap screwed back on. There were no footprints leading to or from the spot, as if it had been placed there deliberately or dropped long after the original tracks had faded. Canine units were deployed next, trained to pick up the scent of human presence. For several hours, one dog seemed to latch onto a faint trail, leading the handlers up a steep slope of loose stone. But halfway up, the scent vanished completely. The trackers were baffled. The prints, too, had stopped, ending abruptly in the middle of a rock shelf as though Daniel had stepped off the earth itself. As the days dragged on, search grids expanded to cover hundreds of square miles. The park's harsh conditions began to take their toll on the rescue teams. Midday heat blistered the skin, nighttime temperatures plunged low enough to numb fingers. Water ran short. Exhaustion set in. After a month, the official search was scaled back. The conclusion, though never formally stated, was grim. Daniel had either succumbed to the elements or met with an accident in a place so inaccessible that his body might never be found. But for those who knew him, friends, family, fellow rangers, something about the case didn't sit right. There were too many gaps, too many questions. The desert had given up nothing but a hat and a canteen, and beyond that, only silence. The discovery came almost 2 years after Daniel Hayes had vanished without a trace. A group of hikers was navigating a remote, rocky section of Big Bend, an area far from any established trail, when one of them noticed something glinting in the dust. At first, they thought it was just a piece of scrap metal, perhaps from an old campsite. But when they brushed away the dirt, their breath caught. It was a service revolver. The kind issued to park rangers. The hikers, uneasy with their find, carried it carefully back to the nearest ranger station. It didn't take long for the on-duty staff to recognize it. Serial numbers confirmed it belonged to Daniel Hayes. The news hit the tight-knit ranger community like a shockwave. For 2 years, they had seen no sign of him beyond the few scattered clues found in the days after his disappearance. Now, suddenly, a piece of his gear had surfaced. The revolver was examined immediately. Its holster was missing, but the weapon itself showed no signs of rust, despite the harsh desert environment. It had clearly been shielded from the elements for most of the time it had been gone. More unsettling was the fact that the cylinder was empty, all 6 rounds gone. There were no shell casings found with it, and no marks on the gun to suggest a firefight or damage from being dropped. It looked almost as though it had been cleaned. Investigators returned to the location where the hikers had found it, hoping for more evidence. The spot was barren, an isolated outcrop of weather-worn limestone overlooking a narrow gorge. The terrain was treacherous, riddled with cracks and crevices deep enough to swallow a man-hole. But there were no signs of bones, clothing, or other gear. The gun had been resting under a thin layer of loose dirt and windblown debris, tucked against a rock as if deliberately placed there. Theories began to swirl. Some speculated that Daniel had been in trouble, perhaps pursued by someone or something, and had used the revolver until he ran out of ammunition. Others thought it was planted, a cruel hoax or a distraction from what really happened. A few of the older rangers whispered a darker idea, that Daniel had met someone out there in the desert, and that person had walked away with the gun for a time before returning it. For the investigators, the revolver raised more questions than it answered. The emptiness of the weapon was haunting. If Daniel had fired those rounds, at what, or at whom? If he had dropped the gun during a struggle, why had it taken nearly 2 years to reappear? And why here, in a spot that was neither near his last known location nor on any logical escape or patrol route? Some of the searchers from the original mission came back to help comb the surrounding area. They rappelled into the gorge, explored small caves, and used ground-penetrating radar in a few promising spots. Every lead ended the same way: dust, rock, and silence. The revolver was eventually logged as evidence and locked away, but it became a symbol among the Rangers. For them, it wasn't just a lost firearm, it was a fragment of Daniel's last moments, a ghost of a story they still didn't know how to tell. And in the stillness of Big Bend's vast desert, the gun seemed almost to taunt them, proof that Daniel had been there, and a reminder that the desert still kept its secrets. The search for answers intensified after the revolver was found, drawing in not just park rangers but law enforcement agencies from across Texas. Federal agents arrived, bringing advanced tracking equipment, drones, and forensic specialists. For the first time in nearly 2 years, Big Bend's most remote canyons were alive with coordinated activity. But this was no ordinary search. It wasn't just about finding Daniel Hayes anymore. It was about uncovering what had happened in the hours, maybe minutes, leading up to his disappearance. Teams fanned out from the location where the revolver had been discovered. The gorge below was mapped in detail, every boulder, ledge, and crevice photographed and catalogued. The surrounding desert was scanned from the air by thermal imaging drones, even though everyone knew that after 2 years, any heat signature would belong to wildlife, not Daniel. Still, the investigators hoped to spot something unusual: shreds of uniform, an abandoned backpack, anything that could be tied to him. It didn't take long for the searchers to notice an oddity. About half a mile from the revolver's location, tucked between 2 weathered cliff faces, they found signs of a small fire pit. The blackened stones were surrounded by desert scrub, and when tested, the ash inside showed traces of charred cloth fibers. Whoever had used that fire had likely burned clothing. But whose? And when? The find ignited new speculation. Had Daniel built the fire himself, trying to survive? Or had someone else been there, possibly the person who ended up with his revolver? If it was Daniel's clothing in the ash, why would he burn it? Theories ranged from hypothermia-induced confusion to deliberate destruction of evidence. Near the fire pit, trackers identified faint impressions in the hard desert soil, footprints. They were fragmented, worn down by time and wind, but it was clear that more than one person had been there. The pattern suggested at least 2 individuals, maybe 3, moving together toward the gorge. The stride length was odd, too. One set of prints appeared hurried, the other slower, almost dragging. That detail unsettled the rangers who saw it. Investigators expanded their search, combing the area for more traces. They found a length of frayed rope snagged on a mesquite bush, weathered by sun and wind. A small, battered metal water canteen lay half buried in the sand nearby. The canteen bore no Park Service markings, suggesting it didn't belong to Daniel, but to someone else entirely. Whoever they were, they had been in that isolated section of the park at some point during the past 2 years. The deeper they looked, the more unsettling the puzzle became. Big Bend was harsh and unforgiving, but it was also vast. People could vanish there without a trace for years, but this felt different. The revolver, the fire pit, the footprints, they hinted at human involvement, maybe even foul play. Around campfires at night, the search teams whispered their own theories. Some thought Daniel had stumbled upon something illegal, a smuggling operation, perhaps, and had been taken. Others imagined a confrontation gone wrong, with Daniel's final moments marked by the emptying of his revolver. A few, quieter voices suggested the possibility of a cover-up, something hidden so deep that only fragments were allowed to surface. By the end of the renewed search effort, no human remains were found. The desert gave nothing more. The fire pit and footprints were documented, samples taken, and evidence stored, but the case remained open and as haunting as ever. The only thing everyone agreed on was that the revolver had not been lost by accident, and its reappearance was no coincidence. Somewhere out there in the sprawling wilderness, the final chapter of Daniel Hayes' story was still waiting to be found. Months after the revolver's discovery, the case of Daniel Hayes refused to fade from public attention. The media had seized on the mystery, portraying it as one of America's strangest unsolved disappearances. Documentaries, podcasts, and online forums dissected every shred of information, often blending fact with speculation. The park itself saw an influx of amateur sleuths, curious hikers, and thrill-seekers determined to find the truth. For the rangers still stationed at Big Bend, it became a balancing act: welcoming visitors while quietly keeping them away from the most sensitive areas of the investigation. One of those areas was the gorge where the revolver had been found. Despite its remoteness, people kept trying to reach it, drawn by the allure of standing where the last known trace of Daniel had surfaced. A few even managed to sneak in, sharing grainy cell phone videos online. Each time, they were met with steep fines and stern warnings, but the damage was done. The internet's fascination only deepened. In the midst of this chaos, a break seemed possible. A retired rancher from a nearby town came forward, claiming he had seen something unusual around the time of Daniel's disappearance. He described spotting two men hiking near the park's southern boundary, far from any official trail, carrying heavy packs. One of them, he swore, wore what looked like a tan park ranger shirt. At the time, he had assumed they were rangers on patrol, but looking back, he wasn't so sure. His statement was taken seriously, but the lead was frustratingly vague. The FBI returned to Big Bend, interviewing locals, ranchers, and seasonal workers. They discovered scattered reports of odd activity in the weeks before Daniel vanished: unmarked vehicles parked along dirt access roads, strange lights in the desert at night, and low-flying aircraft without visible markings. Theories about drug smuggling routes and covert operations swirled, but concrete proof was elusive. Then came another twist. Forensic analysis of the revolver revealed faint traces of fingerprints, two sets. One matched Daniel's. The other was unidentified but belonged to someone with a criminal history in Arizona. This person, however, had died a year earlier in a car accident. How his prints ended up on a park ranger's service weapon became the newest mystery. For Daniel's family, each revelation was a double-edged sword. They wanted answers, but every new clue seemed to pull the truth further away. His sister, Maria, became the family's voice in the media, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. She described Daniel as dedicated to his job, a man who loved the park's beauty and took pride in protecting it. The idea that he might have been killed for stumbling into the wrong place at the wrong time haunted her. Privately, some investigators admitted that the case might never be solved. The desert was vast, and if someone wanted to hide a body, there were countless places it could be concealed forever. Still, the revolver's sudden appearance, after being missing for 2 years, suggested that someone out there wanted the case to resurface. Whether it was a taunt, a warning, or an attempt to mislead, no one could say for certain. As the sun set over Big Bend, painting the cliffs in shades of gold and blood red, the gorge fell silent again. The wind carried the faint scent of creosote and dust, the same as it had the day Daniel vanished. Somewhere in that unforgiving expanse, the truth lay buried, waiting for the right moment, or the right person, to uncover it. And until then, the story of the vanished park ranger remained an open wound in the heart of the desert.